This is The Quiet End, and tonight I'll tell you a story titled The Hollow Child. Let's begin. The storm had been relentless, hammering down on the orphanage with sheets of rain that slashed sideways in the wind. Thunder ruptured the air, shaking the frail wooden shutters as Miss Harper, weary but resolute, made her rounds. It was a night for nightmares, not miracles. And yet, when she heard the sharp rattle of the iron gates, she found herself daring to hope. With a lantern held high, she trudged through the flooded grounds. The light flickered in the gale as she peered through the bars. There, shivering and soaked to the bone, stood a child. Thin as a shadow, their hollow gaze met hers, and a chill deeper than the rain cut through her resolve. It was impossible to tell the child's age or even their gender in the dim light. Their face seemed blurred, softened in ways she couldn't explain. "You poor thing," she whispered, her voice swallowed by the storm. "Come inside, let's get you warm." The child said nothing, not a word of thanks, not a whisper of fear. Yet they followed, trailing muddy footprints across the polished floors of the orphanage foyer. Miss Harper helped peel the wet rags from their skin and wrap them in a blanket, but as she knelt to meet their eyes, she was struck by how stark, how strange they were, void of light, as though the rain had washed the stars from them. "What's your name?" she tried. Still, silence. She called for the other caretakers, her voice a little more urgent than intended. Within minutes, whispers spread among the staff and the few children still awake. Who was this silent, soaked creature that fate had deposited at their doorstep? Compassion warred with unease, but Miss Harper refused to let her fears show. "We'll find your family in the morning," she murmured, though she doubted her words. As she rose to her feet, the lantern's light caught the child's bare hands. No dirt beneath the nails, no bruises from the storm. It was as though they'd been untouched by the world. But just as she turned to lead them to the small bed in the spare room, the child finally reacted, in the faintest, strangest of ways. The corner of their lips curled, almost imperceptibly, into something that wasn't quite a smile. The child settled quietly into the orphanage, almost too quietly. They slept without stirring, rarely ate, and never spoke. Days turned into weeks, yet no memory of who they were, or where they had come from, surfaced. Miss Harper tried to reassure the other children, yet doubt slipped into her own heart. It wasn't the silence that unnerved her. No, it was the strange way it seemed to ripple outward, infecting the whole building. At first, it was nothing anyone could prove. Light bulbs flickered whenever the child entered a room, casting erratic shadows that clawed at the walls. Some of the oldest bulbs blew out entirely, leaving the hallways dimmer than usual. Miss Harper instructed Mr. Lee, the handyman, to replace them, but new bulbs didn't last long either. The cold came next, a biting chill that crept through the orphanage despite the roaring furnaces downstairs. Then came the whispers. None of the caretakers heard them, of course, but the other children did. "They call my name in the dark," Sam, one of the boys, murmured one night, clutching his blankets with trembling hands. "They ask me to come into the halls." Miss Harper had dismissed it as overactive imagination, but when two girls claimed an unseen figure had pulled at their braids while they slept, she felt her unease deepen. But the worst was Richard. He was the boldest of the children, the sort who mocked shadows rather than feared them. Yet even Richard grew wary, stumbling over himself to avoid the hallway outside the spare room. "It's longer than it should be," he whispered once, refusing to meet her gaze. "That hall. When I walk down it, it stretches and stretches, and I never reach the end." Miss Harper tried to convince herself it was just the strain of bringing a new child into the fold, but the staff grew uneasy as well. Mr. Lee reported hearing faint knocks against the boiler room door, knocks that stopped whenever he opened it. Then there was Bertie from the kitchen, who swore her knives kept sliding off the counters on their own. And through it all, the orphanage continued to grow colder and dimmer, until even the caretakers layered their clothes and lit candles in quiet corners for some semblance of warmth. The child, however, didn't seem affected by the chill. They simply sat in the corner of the common room, staring at nothing, or perhaps at something unseen. And late at night, when Miss Harper dared to pass by their room, she thought she saw the faintest movement behind the frosted glass of the door. Not the child, but the shadow cast by them. A shadow that seemed alive. It was the cold that woke Miss Harper that night, an icy weight that squeezed her lungs and sent shivers down her spine. As she pulled her shawl tighter, she heard the panicked rapping on her door. Mary, one of the younger caretakers, burst inside, her face pale as parchment. "Miss Harper, he's gone! Thomas is gone!" The words struck her with the force of a blow. Confused, she hurried down the hallway with Mary stumbling behind. The other children clustered near the boys' dormitory door, their faces frozen with fear. Inside, Thomas's bed lay unmade, the blankets tossed aside as if he'd simply walked out during the night. His meager belongings sat untouched, his coat still hung by the door, his shoes left where he'd kicked them off hours before. Miss Harper scanned the room, the candlelight warping the shadows as it danced on the walls. It was Sam who pointed a trembling finger toward the corner. "He's just sitting there," the boy whispered. Miss Harper turned slowly, and her breath caught. The silent child was crouched in the farthest corner, their knees pulled to their chest, their face turned toward the wall. They weren't moving, not even to breathe. The shadows around them seemed heavier somehow, pooling unnaturally beneath their form. She approached carefully, each step weighed down by growing dread. "Do you know where Thomas is?" she asked softly, more out of instinct than reason. The child didn't turn their head, didn't blink. Their gaze remained fixed on the wall, yet Miss Harper felt the oppressive sensation of being watched. "Nothing," she whispered to Mary, her voice nearly lost. "They won't answer." The hours stretched endlessly as they searched the orphanage, from the attic to the damp basement where rats scurried between shadows. But there was no trace of Thomas. No footprints in the snow outside, no sign he had ever left, nor any clue of where he could have gone. When night fell again, the chill grew unbearable, as though the building itself had lost its warmth. Lamps dimmed prematurely, their flames sickly and weak, while the darkness beyond the light seemed to writhe. As Miss Harper made her way to her room, she felt the presence of shadow in every corner, pulsing like a great unseen heart. And once, just once, she thought she heard Thomas's voice, faint and broken, calling her name from somewhere deep within the walls. But when she turned, there was only silence. Miss Harper's dreams began as a trickle, faint images carried along the current of her unsettled sleep. But as the nights passed, they evolved into something she could not escape, something she dared not name. It always began the same, a vast emptiness, stretching endlessly. A hollow space so immense, it felt as if it would consume her mind entirely. From the void came whispers, coiling and writhing like smoke in her lungs. "Miss Harper," they hissed, not in one voice, but in a dozen. Male and female, young and old. Their words burrowed like worms beneath her skin, saying things she could not, would not repeat aloud. She would wake drenched in sweat, her breath hitching like a caught thread. But no matter how she tried, she could never recall the exact words whispered in her ear. The exhaustion began to wear on her. She found herself stumbling through her days unfocused and trembling. Coffee provided no solace, nor did the meager sunlight filtering through the increasingly dim hallways, and always, she would catch the child watching her from afar. Their dark, vacant eyes seemed to pierce through her like needles, their expression as blank as the surface of a still pond. At first, she told herself she was imagining it. Of course, they were staring. They barely knew how to interact with the world. But as the whispers began to echo in her waking moments, trailing faintly behind her every breath, she could no longer feign ignorance. One night, as she dozed fitfully, she was pulled from her restless sleep by the sensation of being watched. Her eyes snapped open. The child stood at the foot of her bed. The blanket slipped from her grasp as her hands went limp. The oppressive stillness of the moment crushed her will to speak. The child's eyes locked onto hers, and she swore they weren't human anymore. They were impossible, fathomless depths, voids where time and space unraveled. Gazing into them was like staring into the heart of her nightmares, that vast, hollow darkness bringing whispers to life. Her voice finally broke free, shaking and desperate. What are you doing here?" The child tilted their head slightly, almost curious, but said nothing. They simply stood there, their presence delivering a silence so complete it swallowed even the sound of her panicked breathing. Finally, Miss Harper dared to blink, and they were gone. Yet their absence brought no relief, only the suffocating weight of a shadow that refused to leave her room. The orphanage was unraveling. Fear now clung to every corner, thicker than the chill in the air. The children whispered of those who had vanished, their beds swallowed by dark stains that rippled like black water yet remained dry to the touch. The staff tried to maintain order, but their strained smiles and trembling fingers betrayed them. Miss Harper bolted every door, turned every key. The remaining children were gathered and kept in the common room, huddling close as the dim, flickering lamps painted their faces with hollow shadows. She wanted to keep them safe, but how could she protect them from something she couldn't understand? And through it all, the silent child sat apart, their presence a quiet, unspoken dread. They showed no fear, no sadness, nothing. It was as if the chaos around them didn't register, or worse, didn't matter. It was Mr. Grayson, broad-shouldered and stubborn, who decided enough was enough. "This is the source," he declared, pointing to the child. "No one else vanishes if we take them out of here." Miss Harper pleaded with him, her words trembling, but desperation infected the others. Mr. Grayson scooped the child into his arms, carrying them toward the front entrance as the staff and children trailed behind, watching in tense silence. As he unlatched the heavy iron doors, the storm outside churned with unnatural fury. The wind howled as though the earth itself protested his decision. And then it happened. The moment his foot crossed the threshold, the shadows surged. They erupted from nowhere, liquid and alive, wrapping around him like black tendrils. He screamed, a sound so primal and raw that it echoed forever in Miss Harper's mind. But it was brief. The shadows swallowed the sound, swallowed him, leaving nothing behind but an emptiness that defied reason. The child slipped from his grasp before the darkness took him. And as the staff stumbled back, gasping in horror, the child simply stepped over the threshold, back into the asylum of the orphanage, untouched, unchanged. They walked past the others, eyes turned forward, expression unreadable. Miss Harper's legs felt locked, as though the floor beneath her had become part of her very being. The child passed her without a glance, and when their shadow brushed hers, her breath stopped, but not from cold nor from fear, from the hollowness it left behind. The orphanage was unrecognizable. The halls where children once laughed and played had melted away, devoured by shadows that pulsed and rippled like living things. Miss Harper stood alone now, save for the silent child who lingered near the heart of the abyss that had taken them. The few lamps that remained flickered weakly, their light barely penetrating the inky darkness. The walls trembled, no longer solid, shifting and disintegrating as the orphanage dissolved into something unreal. Miss Harper clung to the child, desperation tearing at her throat. "Please," she whispered, her voice cracking. "Tell me who you are. Tell me what you are. Please, speak, just speak to me." The child blinked slowly, their gaze steady, unchanging. The shadows stirred around them, whispering like 1,000 fractured voices murmuring in a language she could never understand. And then, as the light began to fade entirely, she saw. Their eyes weren't human. They weren't eyes at all. They were endless voids, gateways to something beyond comprehension. Within them swirled a vast, unknowable expanse, an infinite blackness dotted with faint specks, stars that burned cold and distant deep within an abyss that devoured reality itself. The walls collapsed into the darkness, consumed piece by piece as the floor beneath her feet crumbled away. Miss Harper tightened her grip on the child, tears streaming down her face. "Please," she begged. But they remained silent, their expression empty. As the last flicker of light was extinguished, Miss Harper and the orphanage were swallowed whole. The shadows closed in, consuming all sound, all warmth, all life. And when everything was gone, there was only silence and despair. So tell me, dear listener, if you heard whispers in the dark and saw shadows creeping closer, would you dare to stay, or would you wonder if the hollow were already here? Subscribe for more chilling tales, and hit the bell to stay in the dark. See you at the next Quiet End.